My name is Carlo Gallo. I run a political risk and business intelligence consultancy based in London. What we do is helping clients, mostly multinationals, understand the threats and opportunities that they face when they operate in volatile jurisdictions, emerging markets, frontier markets, and helping them make sense and contextualize the flow of news that come from those regions, as well as prepare for major strategic decisions that they have to take in their operations. It could be decisions on a merger or an acquisition. It could be a decision on whether to take on a certain local partner or not. It could be whether to expand their activities in a certain part of a new country or not, or even whether they would be well advised to send their personnel to that particular location at that particular time, given the threat environment. So helping them make all sorts of very important decisions. When political risk was emerging as a field of inquiry and of consulting services, and we're talking about the 60s, 70s, it was actually also sometimes called non-economic risk, which means that it was a catch-all phrase to capture everything that was not just strictly economic. And indeed, I think this goes to show how varied and how broad political risk as a concept really is, because effectively we are talking about helping clients understand their exposures to a number of adverse potential outcomes that can stem from political, cultural, social, economic, integrity variables. And as you can see, this definition is extremely broad. So what we do with political risk advisory services can range from helping a client understand whether that particular government in that corner of the world is likely to adopt a certain type of taxation rules, or whether they have been friendly with foreign investors or unfriendly, or whether their commitment that seems to appear very welcoming of foreign investors today is likely to change down the road. Government stability, whether the political elite that is in place today is likely to remain in place after the next election, but also things like what is the threat of terrorism to our assets in that region, or to our supply chain network. What is the threat posed by anti-money laundering, anti-bribery regulations, again, in the view of our complex supply chain that most multinationals nowadays have to rely on, which tends to be really global. So it's an extremely broad range of issues characterized by the common denominator of the variables that can impinge on business outcomes come from the political, social, cultural context of business operations. Today, the world spins at a much faster rate than 10 years ago. That means that any incident or crisis that occurs in one corner of the world reverberates very quickly elsewhere. And this is apparent, for example, if you're looking at the financial sector. We have all seen the extent to which financial crises travel across the globe. But it is also true of more physical supply chain situation, because multinationals today do operate on a global scale, and they are dependent on a very complex chain of suppliers and distributors who are located in all corners of the world, and exposes them to being dependent on a certain geography that could at some point become disrupted with political, social issues such as a strike or civil unrest, or a more sort of natural disasters. We have seen the Fukushima case certainly illustrating that for many companies. And also increasingly important, there is an increasing pressure on businesses to be very proactive in monitoring exactly what each of those partners around the world are up to from the point of view of integrity and business ethics. There is certainly a legal pressure on companies, both at the national level in the UK and the US, but also internationally, European level, to conduct themselves increasingly stringently when it comes to checks against anti-money laundering risks, anti-terrorism financing, anti-bribery, the risk that you are perhaps condoning or aiding modern slavery issues, or you need to be very attentive to the impact that your business operations may have on human rights or social rights of the communities that surround your projects. Typical example is mining projects, where the environmental impact of some of the mining projects in developing countries can notoriously be quite drastic for local communities. So the best companies are those who engage with those local communities. They plan ahead, they hear what those local communities have to say, and put in place risk mitigation strategies well ahead. So the risks that we are seeing today are to do with the pace of the flow of information and the flow of crisis that can quickly escalate from one corner to the globe, the extent to which companies have to operate on a global scale, which also is the global scale that businesses have to have today is challenging, because we are also seeing a trend for different regional blocks and different leading countries within those regional blocks to become more protective of their business environments. There is a tendency for perhaps in some cases rolling back globalization and the integration of economies within the wider global economy. So that creates challenges for multinationals who have to be operating on such a wide range of countries. Regulatory challenges, corruption challenges, all sorts of risks to do with the convertibility of their profits abroad, the risk that contracts that they've signed with the host governments may not be fulfilled anymore. Plus, I suppose the risk that everybody is quite aware of today, which is very general, is just a general mode of the general slowdown of the global economy, starting with China, which is slowing down compared to the growth rates that we've been used to in the last decade or so. And that obviously is an economic variable that has political implications, because economic slowdown in many parts of the world can mean an increase in chances of political instability, social unrest, and the like. And also it is a field that can be impacted by political decisions. You know, the monetary and economic policies that places like China are going to take can make a difference, or the Eurozone can make a difference on economic variables. So every time that there is a political cause or a political effect of economic variables, we certainly are there to interpret those and help clients understand what's going on and going to happen. There are certainly limits to the extent that human beings are able to predict the futures that are inherent in the human condition and the cognitive abilities of human beings. As I mentioned before, we are dealing with trends and issues that are extremely complex, and also issues and environment that are open to unexpected interactions and unexpected developments. So when we say that we are experts on certain countries, certain issues, nevertheless there are limits to what expertise can achieve in such an open field compared to what an expert will be able to achieve in a closed environment, such as, for example, chess playing, where there is a finite set of rules, a finite set of pieces that you can move only in so many positions. And obviously it's a very complicated game, but it is ultimately not an open system to the extent that geopolitics, political and social variables are, also because we are dealing with human agency, which is itself strategic and changing and adaptive. And so there is all sorts of complexity and volatility, yes, so it's an inherently different ball game. So there are those limits. Technology is, like in many other fields, professional fields, technology is becoming more important, particularly algorithms and the automation of some of the more routine tasks that at the moment or up to until now have been carried out by human analysts. And of course, computers, algorithms are particularly good at hoovering huge amounts of information from the net, from open sources particularly, also social media, and very quickly, almost in real time, paint a picture of what's trending in this or that location, what the sentiment is relative to certain issues or certain brands. And the sheer power of these kind of applications is massive. And so there is a place for this kind of new technology to aid the work of human analysts, I believe. However, when it comes to very complicated, sensitive, and often confidential inquiries that companies have to run and get help with, then it is really difficult to imagine that a robot or an algorithm could help. In other words, you do need a very deep understanding of how a country works informally, of who is allowed with whom in a certain sector at the political and business level, and those connections will often not appear in the publicly available media. You need to understand the reputation of people, the track records, and also, very importantly, I think the analyst does need to have a certain amount of, say, educated imagination as to what can realistically happen given the map that you see today, given the circumstances you see today. And this is an imagination that, of course, is constrained within the limits of the knowledge that you have of the country, the realm of possibilities that you do know it applies to that particular situation. So it's not just wild imagination, of course, but it is imagination after all, and that's why I think creativity, imagination, I think is still a quality that computers are struggling to replace. Judging from my own experience, the good news that I would offer is that it is a very rewarding place to be, particularly when you are put in a position to leverage many years of in-depth study, say study of a country or an issue, and perhaps you've written a dissertation on the topic. So you have really digged deep into some issues, and you get the opportunity to use all that to affect very concrete and very important business decisions that have very large consequences for companies, whether it's financial consequences or safety and security consequences or reputational consequences for them. So it is very rewarding, it's very exciting to be contributing to that level of practical impact, which is not necessarily something that somebody who would stay in academia, for example, gets to do very often. So that's very rewarding, and I would encourage graduate students to pursue this kind of career, if nothing else, because they might be attracted by that prospect. The advice I would give is that whether you like it or not, most of the jobs as political risk analysts are effectively defined in regional terms. So the bulk of the positions are still for analysts that would be experts of a region of the world or a big country of the world. So the former Soviet Union, China and East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East. Different companies would apportion the globe in different ways to their analysts, depending on how many analysts they have in-house. But nevertheless, the bulk of the roles out there in this particular role of political risk analyst is still defined in that way. So what that means for graduates is that they do need to build up their CV to demonstrate that deep country or regional expertise. And how do you do that? Well, certainly choosing your subject of study is one thing, choosing the overall degree, but also the subject that you go through as part of that degree, and the topic that you explore in your dissertation could already be evidence of that specialization. Extremely important is the language skills that needs to speak of that expertise, to be consistent with what you're claiming to be expert on. The fact that you probably will need to have spent some time living in the country or region that that you're claiming to be expert on. So this is already quite a powerful sort of mix of characteristics to have. Because the job market is so competitive these days, I would add that on top of your very good academic results and marks from reputable universities like Durham, for example, you do need to ideally try and get as much practical experience as possible, either during your summer periods at university or after university. And it doesn't have to be immediately a paid job or a very flashy sounding role, but again, it has to contribute to building up your CV as an expert of the country. So it could be that you are working for an NGO that is focused on that region of the world, perhaps gives you an opportunity to spend some time in that region. It could be that you are monitoring elections for the OECD for those countries, or it could be that you are working for a think tank that is producing a lot of good quality research on issues and countries that are relevant, and perhaps you get to help with those publications. So anything that can testify to your being increasingly an expert would certainly help, on top of those other things that I mentioned before. Yeah.